facilitation of the Torah in and out of the ark, no small matter these days. So many things we might have taken for granted earlier, we are no longer able to. And again, a Kenner Fishman, Yishar Kochech to you, beautiful davening today. I want to let folks know that following this sermon, I'll be headed to teach our grade high school students. So if you happen to be inclined to chat me after this is over, I won't see it. Feel free to be in contact after Shabbat. Didn't want you to think I might be ignoring you or avoiding you. So as Rabbi Steiner mentioned earlier, the centerpiece of the narrative of Parashat Yitro is also a hinge point for our entire existence as a people and as humanity. And that is the revelation of something of God's presence, an event that produced our understanding of what have come to be known as the Ten Commandments. I won't ask you how many of them you can name, and I won't go into the different ways of counting them or your favorite or least favorite one. Instead, I'll start by asking a question that others have asked before and which represents a way of affirming and clarifying core values. And that question is, what should the 11th commandment be? There are some jokey responses to this question. Ronald Reagan said it was, "Thou shalt not speak ill of any fellow Republican." Some say it is, "Call your mother." Another, "Thou shalt not get caught." And a cheeky one, "Thou shalt not make a 12th commandment." And one more for you, "Mind your own business." But beyond the jokes, there are some serious replies. Shimon Peres said his would be, "Respect your sons and daughters." So committed was he to the future he believed only they could create. Another deep thinker said it should be, "Thou shalt not spread my word with the sword." And famous in some circles is the statement of theologian Emil Fackenheim, who said the 11th commandment is, "Thou shalt not hand Hitler a posthumous victory," namely by forgetting you're Jewish and allowing Judaism to die out through your inaction. I don't think we can accuse anyone on our Zoom service during a global pandemic of substantially violating that one. I want to suggest another, and that is, thou shalt affirm, support, and defend democracy. And that we should do so as a Jewish idea, motivated by Jewish values, which is perhaps a little strange because you can scour the Torah and also the Talmud and find little support for democracy as a Jewish governing system. Most of the Bible represents a theocratic monarchy, meaning religious rule with a king at the top. The Talmud was written at a time when Jews had no sovereignty and no control over their governance, other than perhaps some civil and light criminal matters, including tax collection and support of the poor. Jews, though, have been aligned with every governing authority under the sun, sometimes because we agreed with them and sometimes for self-preservation. Jews have been communists and socialists, anarchists and Democrats with a small d. At times, we have even placed hopes in autocrats and oligarchs, not because we wanted to, but as a pathway towards survival. We've had to be flexible with allegiances because with powerlessness came a tenuous grip on security. So Jews have adapted to every environment and every governmental system in which we have found ourselves. Nevertheless, most of our historical experiences ended in exile or worse. Though it is no guarantee of a people's success in a country not fully their own, it is a representative democracy, being governed by the will of the people, that has the best chance for a minority to be protected and to thrive. It is also more tenuous than we sometimes realize. And the one example of this insecurity occurred to our horror on January 6th. Another has been unfolding over this past week. The Southeast Asian country of Myanmar, or Burma, has been in the spotlight of pro-democracy activists around the world. The Jewish community has also taken note of its unfolding drama, with a working group convened by none other than the American Jewish World Service, some of whose meetings I attend. You may recall that Burma's elected leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, was held in house arrest for years while the military ruled the country. Unable to regularly communicate with the outside world, she became a Mandela-like figure, at least in people's imaginations. She was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991, which was accepted on her behalf, since she was not permitted to travel. Many hopes were pinned to her, just like the signature flower in her hair. When Mandela was freed, he became a voice of reconciliation and fairness. A few years ago, it was Suu Kyi's turn as the military decided to share some power with her, the country's chosen leader. Much to the chagrin of those watching around the world, but by all reports, not to the chagrin of most of her own people, Suu Kyi fulfilled her duties with too little attention paid to human rights, including for the Rohingya Muslims who were mistreated, exiled, and at times killed for their minority status. Her defenders say she was walking a fine line, knowing that the military could take back power at any moment. And anything she did that was better than what they would have done should count as progress toward a more peaceful tomorrow for that embattled country. Detractors, or perhaps realists, said what might be painful to hear. The world saw what it wanted to see in the imprisoned leader, and how they saw her was not how she saw herself. We may one day know the truth, and we may also never know. Earlier this week, as you may have read or seen, the military indeed took back power in a coup and arrested Suu Kyi and many other officials and activists, declaring recent election results fraudulent and invalid. At last report, no one knew for sure where she was being held. A tenuous experiment in fledgling democracy had failed. Taken in connection with the jailing of activist Alexei Navalny in Russia by their autocratic ruler, we are reminded of what the late Tom Lantos, the only Holocaust survivor to serve in the United States Congress, said. We must remember that the veneer of civilization is paper thin. We are its guardians, and we can never rest. He said civilization, but I think had he observed the events of the last few weeks here and around the world, he likely would have agreed that democracy is also more fragile than we care to admit, and his call to guard it unceasingly would be just as applicable. We may love democracy, respect those who defend it, answer the call to participate in it, but how is it Jewish? How is it Jewish enough to be my 11th commandment? Well, I have three approaches to share with you from three great and accomplished thinkers. The exceptional professor of Yiddish literature, and more than that, Ruth Weiss, gives us a Yitro-oriented possibility, writing, if democracy encourages governance from below, by the people, of the people, and for the people, then the memory of all the Jews standing at Sinai, and later the practice of all the Jews reading from the Torah, would certainly have encouraged a democratic culture. And there's something in this, I think, as we teach that every citizen has a role and responsibility to build a country, so too does every Jew bear the hopefully joyous burden of carrying our tradition forward and not only relying on others to do so for them. Conservative scholar Norman Ornstein wrote about the aspects of Judaism that are consistent with building a democratic state. In Judaism, where you have an enormous tolerance for different viewpoints, a culture built around argument, a willingness to tolerate dissent, a focus on the larger society and helping others in need, the whole concept of tzedakah, all of those things, it seems to bolster many of the ideas of democracy and freedom. Perhaps he's being a touch idealistic on the blanket affirmation of Judaism's, quote, enormous tolerance for different viewpoints. But it's still a well-stated and cogent linking of democratic ideas embedded in our distinctly Jewish norms. Lastly, I want to turn to someone I mentioned earlier. And this was actually the text that made me consider this theme in the first place. I was surprised when I did a Google search for takes, humorous or serious, on the 11th commandment. I was surprised to find a known quote of Israeli Prime Minister, President, and builder of the State of Israel, Shimon Peres. As a reminder, he said that his 11th commandment would be to respect your sons and daughters. But I recently had the chance to read his autobiography, the last sentences of which were put to paper just weeks before he died. And it is in the very last part of the book that he seeks to communicate something about Judaism and democracy that is critical for us to understand if we want to build toward a brighter and better future despite challenges. The acolyte and right-hand man of David Ben-Gurion, who would grow to become Israel's most profound dreamer, wrote this: I believe with all my being in the virtue of Zionism and in the historic decision made by Ben-Gurion to accept the UN resolution for a partitioned Palestine. Even then, Ben-Gurion understood that in order to retain the Jewish character of our state, we had to uphold our values, and that our values are fundamentally democratic. Jews are taught that we are all born in the image of God. To believe this fundamental tenet, a Jewish state must embrace democracy, which demands full equality between the Jews and non-Jews. Democracy, after all, is not only the right of every citizen to be equal, but also the right of every citizen to be different. To give up on democracy is to abandon our Jewish values. Peres grounds the dream of Israel, indeed the dream of humanity, in mutual respect. Not tolerance, which is begrudging, but honoring differences, even while seeking out commonalities. The only one excluded from the conversation and project is the one who espouses, incites, or participates in violence against those who seek to act peacefully. It is a large tent, but it is not unbounded. Our own country, the world's greatest and most enduring democracy, is in the midst of a mighty struggle unlike anything in its history. Israel faces similar challenges as it travels the narrow path of balancing democracy and security. And countries around the world that we tend to pay less attention to have demonstrated that the project can unravel, especially if it is not rooted in the fertile soil of keeping the military out of politics, free and fair elections, and leaders who are as willing to give up power as they are to claim it. As always, there is work to be done. And whether you agree with me or not that the concept is so important as to rise to the level of an 11th commandment, our engaged, creative, and adaptive Judaism affirms that the very idea of democracy is a gift from God working through inspired minds. May ours and that of others be genuine, strong, resolute, and enduring. Shabbat Shalom. Continue with Musaf, which begins Chatzi Kaddish, page 155.
Koyach, Rabbi.